Now, aging power stations and delays in commissioning new ones are some of the contributing factors to the power supply crisis in the country. In our special focus on power supply crisis, we're now joined by renewable energy expert Francis Jackson. Mr. Jackson, good morning and thank you very much for your time. Now, as an advocate for renewable energy, you've maintained there's remarkable industrialization opportunity in this space. But there are critics, of course, that renewables may be better for the environment. They're a lot less cheaper than what they were back then. But still, the projects are capital intensive, and there's also the political side of things around our coal reserves. So what do you make of that whole argument?
Hi, good morning, and thank you for having me. I think when we speak of this, we must be aware that there are as many perspectives on it as there are stakeholders to the process. Yes, you mentioned the work I've done recently on trying to enable industrialization in the value chain of renewables. And we're speaking specifically today, I think, about just getting that capacity online to help with closing the supply-demand gap. I think we must also recognize that when we speak of Eskom, Eskom is a big beast. It has many crises. Its debt crisis, the efforts to get the capacity of its own fleet going, and enabling the rollout of the new renewable energy generation from the private sector through the procurement programs of the government. I think I'd like to recognize that we can only give our views. I've had the opportunity to understand from the CEO and from the energy transition team some of the very pragmatic and well-driven efforts that they're trying to work on to enable the rollout of the new capacity. They've put recommendations to government on how to unlock immediately available capacity where there's excess indeed in existing IPPs, making land available, Eskom land for development of renewable projects, and Eskom having covered their parts of the process to establish the independent system and market operator. So I think when we look at the issues, we must be very clear on the time frames for working on it. Specifically, we've got now in the next 3 months, we've got what can be done in 3 to 12 months, say, and then 12 to 24 months, and then in the longer term, the 2-year plus time frame. Talking about issues being raised by people about what's changed since the IRP was first drafted in the assumptions that could potentially inform updates to the IRP to cover what's changed since then. For example, that we now know the energy availability factor of Eskom's fleet is lower than was assumed in IRP 2019. But we know that that process is long, and what's most pragmatic right now. You know, in the short term, if you're a small business, immediately you could go out and get yourself a 5,000 Rand UPS to keep your pay point going and your Wi-Fi, or indeed install your own solar power and battery, which could power your business and over the course of 5 to 8 years pay for itself. In the short term, I think if you look at what private sector acknowledges and is indicating, the pressures on private sector to reduce their own costs, to decarbonize the products that they would like to be able to export to other markets, and to secure supply, mean that there's a massive untapped opportunity in the private sector rollout of renewable energy capacity. So we've got the Eskom and the government procurement programs and much debate about that right now, but we can talk about also the 5,000 plus megawatts of renewable energy capacity that major corporates, mines and energy intensive users would like to roll out in the next 10 years. And Operation Bullet Lead are working to help to unlock that. So the ability to do that quickly relates to the fact that there's shovel-ready and bid-ready projects that are waiting, for an opportunity to be built. This is the kind of 3 to 12 month opportunity that could be tapped, where you've got mines who see to bring their costs down. Purchasing renewable energy on a private PPA basis for their own development is cheaper than the supply they can get. It helps to decarbonize their products, so they'll have an offtake market for the international market. And then there's the matter of security of supply. Mm-hmm. So in that short-term opportunity, we've got there are existing IPPs which have additional capacity. In fact, it was one of the recommendations of Eskom to government to enable those IPPs to make that additional capacity immediately available. Then we have the process to try to unlock that private pipeline. And we've seen very recently the indication, Minister Creasy saying that her department will help the provinces in approving those environmental impact assessments to unlock that. And the matters of making transmission capacity available, streamlining the NERSA process and enabling wheeling in local distribution networks. That's the immediate short-term opportunity. In the 12 to 24 month implementation of the IRP is really the matter to unlock what's happening right now and continue with rolling out the green process. So those are the kind of the three time frames. I can talk to each one of them. If you can guide me on the questions you'd like to speak to, I'd be very happy.
You know, I want to now focus, because you've so succinctly explained or taken us through the short term, but then the longer term, because this is where the problem lies. That if we were to talk about renewables in the long term, I know with most of you experts, you don't want to confine the debate to just renewables. You want there to be a distinction within those renewables, because they all have their own advantages, be it solar, be it hydro, be it biomass. So just take us through the advantages, perhaps even disadvantages, of the renewables in the longer run.
Right. Sure. So the longer term consideration brings into account the factors that are considered in the integrated resource planning process. And there's a modeling process there that looks at what's your cost, what's your time to bring it online, and your socioeconomic matters such as job creation, how much water does it use, and what's the carbon content. And then, of course, cost per unit is made up of a blended cost. So you'll want to look at what goes into that mix that makes sure that A, it's the cheapest per unit, per kilowatt hour, but B, when you make sure that you're able to provide demand when it's needed and you're using variable resources, you need a mix. So that modeling process comes to an optimal mix that's least cost, and then you're going to adjust it, policy adjust it. So when you look at those factors I considered before, on a kilowatt hour basis, the cost of renewables and the indications we've seen from the last bid rounds clearly pushes the solar and the wind in to the model, because we've seen, the last round had some 45 cents per kilowatt hour in the government procurement program. That's a natural winner. This is the energy cost, right? And then the other parameters for decarbonizing, etc., also push it in. When you look at security of supply, there's a lot of misinformation, red herrings debate about it. It needs to be borne in mind when you say, okay, renewables are a variable source. That means you need a mix. The premise behind that is, of course, perfectly rational. The quantums can lead the discussion down different paths that in some cases are misleading. So when you take into account that you've said we need a high renewables mix with variable, with the ability to match variable demand and supply with flexible capacity, it comes up with it being a least cost in a blended cost model. So it still drives high renewables in that scenario. You might need some flexible capacity. In the medium term, we actually have the requisite flexible capacity online to be rolling out existing IRP quantums as fast as possible. So it's not a medium-term adjustment that's needed to manage variability. The future modeling will push that there's a quantum of flex, and that can come from demand response, from hydro, from pump storage, from gas, and indeed from the increasingly cheap battery storage at a utility scale, where in some markets we're already seeing that battery energy storage is competitive with gas in providing grid ancillary services. So that's one of the factors that has become, the assumptions of which have changed since the last IRP modeling. So I anticipate that if there's an update to the model, we will see an increased capacity of renewables with flexible capacity coming online, and that will yield the cheapest blended cost. The argument to say, well, you need to build more megawatts to get the same amount of megawatt hours is true, but you must say, so what? Does it affect the cost per kilowatt hour? And the answer is no. If you have to build 100 megawatts to get X kilowatt hours, it's still 45 cents per kilowatt hour. Versus building 300 megawatts to get the same amount, if you know what I'm saying.
No, it's honestly very, very technical for most people, and I think that's why they disengage. But at the center of it is that energy is in fact critical for our economy at this point. And it seems that the capacity, if we're looking at just below 50%, then we certainly, like you say, need to bring in more capacity, and it's in the renewables. We need that mix. But what has consistently led to them just not listening to most experts outside of government?
I think it's worth recognizing that, like you've said, it is a complex matter, and it's very easy for particular interests to push a particular agenda using some selected parts of the information. And it's worth noticing that, in the debate, some of that information is put forward, some is not, and there are vested interests, of course, for each business sector that has a particular technology they're backing. And as has been shared by the CEO of Eskom, there are interests that still are at play in influencing the decision-making processes. So it's not always a rational debate with the best intentions. I don't think there are any saints in this process. I think business will act rationally. The government will act as fast as it can based on various political pressures upon it. So there are decisions that need to be made quickly. For example, in unlocking bid window 5 and the risk mitigation programs already procured, decisions need to be made now, and the decisions around that will inform the tone and how the response to the next bid window 6, which is now out, play out. But those who are in a position to say this is what we need to do need a very clear mandate to do so and to send the right signals to the private sector in delivering the next quick rounds of renewable energy.
No, Jackson, thank you very much for your time. That is expert Francis Jackson.